You may be wondering, why is that here in the front of the church? You may be wondering, how the heck did it even get here in the first place? Totally legit means. I had a few people say, what about going out late at night and we can ratchet one off? I thought, it's a good point, but I really shouldn't go down that path. Others thought, maybe try the town and the works department. I talked to them and they looked around, but there was no help there. So one particular family came through in an amazing way. The Cochrans came through and provided me with this. So we see them all the time, right? We probably don't often notice them or perhaps even necessarily pay attention to them, but guardrails are a regular part of life. And a guardrail is really something quite simple. It's essentially a system to keep vehicles from straying into dangerous areas. We see them on bridges. We see them around sharp corners. We see them when significant traffic is intersecting at one another. We put up guardrails in order to prevent an even greater accident to occur. And so when we look at these guardrails, we see the reality of how they are put in place in order to protect us, but also to direct us. As a society, we understand the needs for guardrails. We understand the importance of them. And what's interesting about a guardrail is they're actually set up in an area where we could legitimately drive. They're actually set up in a safe part of the road. But very few people, if you have any sense about you, don't say, well, you know what, we should get rid of all the guardrails because I want to drive on the other side. I want to be that much closer to the edge of the cliff or oncoming traffic or a sharp corner. I simply want to be on the edge of life. No, we recognize this is a sensible thing to do. So we set them up. And we notice and appreciate them if we've ever had to use one. Because when you rub up against the guardrail, you realize that yes, there is some damage, and yes, there's some parts of being uncomfortable, but the damage is far less secure, far less significant, because there is a guardrail. And imagine what would have happened if a system such as this was not put in place. You see, guardrails serve an important function in society to keep us safe in driving. But as I heard a gentleman named Andy Stanley from Atlanta speak a couple of weeks ago, he talked about how guardrails become an incredible image for the midst of all of life. That guardrails essentially create for us a margin for error. And I didn't realize how important guardrails were until having lived overseas in Malawi for a number of years and recognizing that they don't put up the same system of protection around their roads. And particularly when you're doing a switchback that goes back and forth about 21 times, and on one side is a mountain, and on another side is a severe drop-off, you think, oof, what I would do for a couple of guardrails right about now. But as much as we recognize their need and we appreciate them in the driving world, we live in a society that so often doesn't want guardrails placed upon us in the midst of life. We live in a society that oftentimes promotes and talks so much about living life on the edge. No one wants to be restricted. No one wants to have kind of rules placed upon them. And oftentimes, one of the great criticisms of Christianity or of following Jesus is there's just so many rules. It seems so restrictive. Why do we always have to be told, do this and don't do that? I simply want to live my life. Don't put up any guardrails that's going to prevent me from fully doing what I want to do. If you've been with us for the last number of weeks, we have been walking through the Old Testament and looking at how God is developing a nation, the nation of Israel, and how God desires to live all of life with them. And one of the things that God does is he continues to tell them, listen, I am going to set you apart. I want you to follow in my ways so that you can truly have this abundant life. But if you read through the Old Testament, you see time and time again people saying, you know what? I don't want that. I don't think I need that in my life. And last week when we left off in the book of Judges, we came to the very final verse in this book of Judges where eventually it made this kind of summary statement when the people essentially says, we are going to do whatever we want. We are going to live however we want to live. And so as you continue reading into the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, you see this reality continuing to play out. Samuel, the final judge appointed by God, is getting older in age, and he feels that it's important that he then introduce his children as the new judges of Israel, the ones who are going to guide them, kind of set up the guardrails in the midst of life. But the people of Israel reject them and say, you know what, we don't want your sons. First and foremost, because we don't really think that they're living the way that you have lived, but more importantly, we want to be like everybody else. We want a king. And so Samuel goes to God and says, God, they have rejected me. And God in 1 Samuel 8 says to Samuel, no, they haven't rejected you. They have rejected me. And it's such a significant statement in the life of Israel. Because when you begin to understand and appreciate what God is doing, God is trying to create a nation that is not going to be like everybody else. Because God sees the way in which everybody else is living and saying, this is not the best way to live. Jesus himself says, I have come so that you may have the abundant life. And so God is setting up a framework in which they can live so that they can be better, they can be different than others and show them a better way of living. And yet what does Israel say? We just want to be like everyone else. We don't want to follow your ways in the midst of life. And so I think one of the challenges that we come across is when we read the Bible, we can come across and see, wow, there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of restrictions. And what part do they play in my life? And so often we can reject the ways of God because it seems as if there's too many guardrails being put up in the midst of life. But when you take a step back and you begin to understand and appreciate what the Bible is all about, when you see the greater narrative and the greater story of what is taking place, they start to make a little bit more sense. You see, the Bible is about God wanting to be in relationship with his people. It's about the creator of this world understanding and knowing the best way to live. And so what does he want to do? He wants to direct us. He wants to protect us. He wants to provide for us, to show us the best way to live. And that's why as followers of Jesus, we always refer to God as our heavenly Father. And so think about it in that context for a moment. As parents, as mothers, as followers, we want to put systems in place for our children in order to give them the best possible life. Right? It's not good parenting. It's actually irresponsible as a parent to say, you know what? I'm just going to let you figure this out on your own. I'm going to let you figure it out on your own. No, parents, we don't do that. We put things in place to help protect them and direct them, to give them the best way possible. We essentially begin to put guardrails in the midst of life, with the understanding of saying, listen, if we're going to have conflict, we want to have conflict at the guardrail, the place where you may think it is totally unreasonable. Why can't I do that in the midst of life? Or why should I be aware of that? Because as a parent, you know the danger of what is on the other side, and you don't want them to get into the danger zone. You want them to rub up against the guardrail. We had this just this past weekend at our home, and as our kids get older and they're wanting to get on the internet and explore YouTube more and more, there's some great things on YouTube. There's funny videos, there's cartoons. I mean, I don't need cable anymore. We can just hook them up with YouTube. But we all know there's certain things on the internet that I do not want my 8, 7, and 5-year-old watching. There's certain things that we want to protect for them. Because we know that if they watch them, it's not going to be helpful. It's going to be destructive. It's going to be hurtful. So one of the rules that we have is, listen, anytime you go on the internet, because we don't want to say the internet is bad and we're going to get rid of all of our computers and you can never surf the internet. So what do? We put up a guardrail. We say, listen, this is the guardrail in our family around the internet. If you want to go on the internet, you have to tell us. And then if you're going to watch something, you have to show us the video. And Isaac, our oldest, is like, every time? I'm like, every time. That's the guardrail, buddy. Get on page with it. And so we had a conversation about it. He's like, Dad, come on. Every time, what if you're not in the room? Then you come get me in the room. What if you're not here? Then you don't watch it. And he gave me one of those, my dad's ridiculous, and walked out of the room. We had conflict at the guardrail, which I'm okay with, because I don't want him getting into what's beyond the guardrail and the dangers that lie ahead. And so why would it be any different with God? If God understands us and knows what is best for us, wouldn't it be the loving, responsible thing for him to do to begin to put guardrails in place in order to protect us? Because one of the interesting things about all of us from the very beginning of this world is that we can take the good things that God has given to us and twist them in such a way that they actually harm us in return. And so God sets up guardrails, these understandings as to how you are to live in such a way that will protect you and direct you ultimately in his ways. We could look at so many places in the Old Testament and just see this reality playing out. But considering that we're now into what is kind of the period of the kings, where the nation says, we want a king, we want someone to rule over us, I thought it would be more helpful to simply pull out two kings in the history of Israel and to show how, because of their inability to put up guardrails in life, they experienced significant regret. And I think it's safe to say that if you think about the regrets that we have made in life, if we would have placed guardrails along the way, perhaps we wouldn't have made those same mistakes. Whether it was financially, relationally, morally, ethically, within our career, within our family. If we would have taken it more serious and put guardrails up in place, perhaps we wouldn't have found ourselves going over the edge of the cliff and thinking, uh-oh, now what? King David, his story is told primarily in 1 Samuel. But in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, you can go there later and read it this week, we come across this place where a situation in life where David should have set up some guardrails. I'm just going to run through the story real quickly. You perhaps are familiar with it. But one day, David is on his roof going for, I don't know, a stroll or a walk or just catching a breath. And he notices this woman, Bathsheba, bathing on the other roof. And he doesn't only notice her, he wants her. And so he inquires about her. And the messenger comes back and says, that's Bathsheba. She's married to a guy named Uriah. He fights in your military, just in case you're wondering. And David says, I still want her. And so she comes, they have sex, she becomes pregnant. David is going off the cliff, so he's like reaching back, trying to save himself. So what does he do? He calls Uriah back, tries to deceive him. He doesn't fall for it. David eventually has him murdered and tries to sweep everything under the carpet. But eventually he's found out. And because of David's inability to put a guardrail up in the midst of his life, he went over the cliff because of his desire and his lust. He ruined Bathsheba's relationship with her husband. The child that was born to them out of the adultery eventually died. And as a longer-standing consequence, David's entire family had significant strife and destruction. All because he failed to put guardrails in place. Fast forward to his son Solomon, who eventually takes over the throne. And Solomon as well struggles with lust and the desire for women. The Bible tells us that he loved many foreign women. Let me just put a number on that type of love for Solomon. 700 wives, 300 concubines, which is an ancient Middle Eastern term for more wives. Simple math, 1,000 wives. Like, dude, what are you thinking? 1,000 wives. Like, come on. Like, talk about not only driving over the cliff, but you just keep going over and over and over. And I asked the question this week of why did he have so many wives? Was it just because he was so overwhelmed with passion and desire? Partially, but 1,000 of them? You see, the custom of the day was oftentimes kings and rulers would marry the daughters of other rulers in order to build better international relationships. And so what was Solomon doing? He was not only loving all these women, but he was being controlled by power and by material wealth. And one of the best ways that he could accomplish this was in marrying many, many women. And so at the end, we're told in 1 Kings that God was displeased with Solomon. And no kidding, because he turned his back on him. You see, good things that God had given to him. You see, so often we say, oh, Christianity is so restrictive around the area of sex, and why do we have these guardrails? And you're always talking about money and power. But again, it goes back to the reality of too often we take the good things that God has given to us and we twist it because of the inability to put up safeguards around them. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us in the midst of life? Guardrails, I believe, are essentially this: a personal standard by which becomes so ingrained in us that it becomes a matter of conscience. That's a fancy way of basically saying a personal standard that we set up, that when we do something we know we shouldn't, it pricks our conscience and it makes us feel bad. It prevents us from going any further. It prevents us from going off the edge of the cliff. And out of that, there's really three things that I see happening. One is to understand this is not about being legalistic, because it's a personal standard. It's not a standard by which you judge other people. So if you have a certain guardrail set up in your life because you realize that is a necessity for you, you don't then going around and look at everyone else and say, how come you're not following my guardrail? Because remember, again, the guardrail is set up in the safe zone where you could actually walk and live and hang out, but you set it up intentionally because you don't want to go off the cliff. But it's a personal standard that you recognize the need for. And so if it's personal, it also means that you understand the areas in which you could easily go off the rails. We live in a society, we live on roads where we don't have guardrails everywhere, but we know around sharp corners, over bridges, oncoming traffic, it's probably a good idea to put them up because that's probably the place where you're going to have an accident. We all struggle with different stuff. The things that you struggle with may not be the things that I struggle with, and vice versa. So we need to understand, where are the areas in my life that I am personally flirting with disaster? And what I need to set up. And so be intentional. A guardrail is not that nice little yellow line that runs along the side of the road so that you can go over it, and as you're going over, you think, I just crossed the line. Woo! You need a guardrail in place that when you bump up against it, you realize that I have gone too far. I'm going to stop right now because I don't want what's on the other side of the cliff. And so what we see in the Bible is so often a reminder to put up guardrails. And that's why sometimes when we read the Bible, we can think, this doesn't always make sense to me. Why are they talking about this and why are they talking about that? Because the Bible is written for us, but it wasn't originally written to us. And so often when Jesus is speaking, or when the Apostle Paul is speaking, or when other followers of Jesus are speaking, they're speaking into a specific circumstance and situation that the people are dealing with at the time. And so we pull from it the principles of what are being taught. So let me just highlight two real quick guardrails to be real practical about how we make it work in our own life. Pulling from the example of King David and Solomon. The first one is the issue of money. The Apostle Paul, speaking to a young Timothy, says, "The love of money is the root of all kinds of sin." Paul is piggybacking on a statement that Jesus said in Matthew 6, when Jesus says, "You cannot serve both God and money." And so what is Jesus doing? He's not saying, you know what, it's a sin to have money. They're not saying, if you have this much money, then you have gone over the edge. No, what Paul and Jesus are constantly talking about is the danger of money and of possessions and wealth and materialism that can so often lead us off the cliff. Do you know that Jesus spoke more about money than anything else in the Bible except for the kingdom of God? Because he understood that tension in life, that we are going to be pulled in the direction of resources. And so for maybe some of us, we wrestle with that. We wrestle with the society that continues to tell us, get more, sacrifice this in order to have more. And so what are the guardrails? I'll just share 3 guardrails that I have in my life around this issue of money. The first one is this. A guardrail for me is the importance of giving generously and regularly. You see, a guardrail doesn't always have to be a negative thing, but it can be a positive thing. So one of the things that Rebecca and I do is we regularly give to the church and to other ministries. Not because we have to, because the Bible's pretty clear. God doesn't need our stuff. He's just afraid that our stuff can bring a lot of damage into our lives. And so one of the guardrails for me is when I find it difficult to be generous in my giving, I notice that I'm pulling up and rubbing a guardrail. And I need to get right with God in the midst of that. People always ask me, what does the New Testament teach about giving, about tithing? Because in the Old Testament, it talks about 10%. But in the New Testament, Jesus never gives a number, which is the amazing thing. But what he does do is talk constantly about generosity. And so what has been helpful for me is that I do give a percentage. So whether I make more or I give less, I'm still giving the same amount in terms of percentage, in terms of reality. That's a guardrail for me. It might not work for you. Second thing I do is I try not to overspend. We've all been there. You see the thing in the store that you're going to pick up something else that was going to cost you like $5, and you walk out with something that was like thousands of dollars, and you think, how did that just happen? You think, I needed this stuff. And you feel bad about it. And you feel a bit guilty about it. You think, I really shouldn't have done it. Maybe that's a guardrail. A guardrail that will then prick your conscience so that you won't then go back into the store and continue to buy more and more and more and more because you think, I deserve it. I deserve this stuff. A third guardrail for me is to be able to celebrate what other people have. When I look at what other people have in their lives, if I'm not able to celebrate what they have, I realize I am being consumed by possessions. Because now I want what they have. I can't celebrate what they have. Those are some guardrails for me. A second area that we see happening so often in the Bible, but particularly with King David and Solomon, is the issue of sex. Listen to what Jesus says about the topic of sex. I mean, if you've ever come across this passage, you have likely quickly skipped through and gone to the next thing and say, let's get Jesus talking about something else because this is crazy. This is off the charts. Jesus says, you have heard it say, do not commit adultery. Okay, I've got that one. If I find myself in bed with someone else other than my wife, I've gone over the cliff. Okay, I'm good. I'm clear on that one. But Jesus says, I say to you, if you've ever looked lustfully at another woman, you've committed adultery in your heart. And then he goes on to say, it is better for you to gouge out your eyes than to go off the cliff. And you're thinking, is this the teaching that Jesus has given me? Or is Jesus making a point about the importance of setting up guardrails? I don't think I obviously don't believe Jesus is telling me to gouge out my eyes. But I do believe he's teaching me the importance of setting up guardrails around the issues of lust and of sex, because the two things that probably ruin marriages more are the issues of finances and the issues of falling in love with someone else. But does it happen overnight? Or does it happen because of an inability to put appropriate guardrails in place? And so I've talked to other people, and I've heard other people talk about what are some of the guardrails that they put in place. One of them is simply not to flirt with the opposite sex. It seems so restrictive. It's just banter. It's nothing wrong with it. Why does the Bible tell us so often, flee, get away, get out of the situation? If you find yourself being attracted to someone other than your spouse, you've banged up against the guardrail. So don't put yourself in that position over and over and over again. If you struggle with various images, then perhaps in the same way that I have to guard my kids in terms of what they watch on the internet, or on TV or in movies, you have to watch as well. And so maybe don't surf the internet late at night. Like, allow that to become just a personal conscience that when you start to do that, you feel guilty and you feel bad. Don't feel bad about feeling bad. Be grateful that it doesn't push you over the edge. Guardrails are simply personal standards by which we live our lives in the safe zone to prevent us from going over the edge. And if you read through the Bible, they are everywhere, where Jesus is talking constantly about the importance of living life with him. And so what does he do? He doesn't just simply say, hey, come and follow me. Come and figure it out on your own. He teaches us, he tells us, he directs us in the midst of life. You see, guardrails are amazing because they not only prevent greater damage from occurring, they direct us in the midst of life. You see, no one plans to wreck their car in the same way that nobody ever plans to wreck their lives. We just fail to plan to prevent it. So this week, maybe take some time and ask yourself, where am I flirting with disaster? Where do I only have a little pretty yellow line painted where I really need one of these bad boys set up? So that when I come up against it, I will know to stop and not go any further and create greater damage and difficulty in the midst of life. I want to end with Scripture. I know it's a bit different. Normally I read from the Bible and I talk about it, but I just want to leave you with one verse. A few people commented to me last week that, the Bible reading was quite long, so I'm going to average it out this week. Only going to send you home with one verse this week, so it works out in the wash. And it's Proverbs 27:12. And it's King Solomon who wrote these words, probably recognizing the importance of living it out in his life as well. It says, the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. Where do you see those areas of temptation and danger playing out in your life? Where do you need to begin to set up some guardrails so that you will not only wreck your life, but you will better understand the ways in which to follow God? It's one verse. Why don't we read it together? The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. Please stand as we sing together.